Before we go any further, let me say this. If not for 24-year-old Shannon Gilbert, the Gilgo Beach murders might still be unknown. Her disappearance triggered a chain of events that exposed one of the biggest serial killing investigations in modern history. Even with an arrest today, we still don't know how deep this goes. To understand the impact of what Shannon uncovered, you have to understand both her and the world she stepped into that night. And that starts with Gilgo Beach. This is Case by Case, and today we are talking about the Gilgo Beach murders, starting with the disappearance of Shannon Gilbert. Before we talk about the night Shannon disappeared, we need to understand exactly where she was, because the setting is one of the most important parts of this case. When people hear the words Gilgo Beach, many picture a crowded shoreline full of sunbathers and lifeguard stands. That's not what this is. Gilgo Beach is located along Ocean Parkway on the southern edge of Long Island, and it's part of a long, narrow barrier island. It runs in a thin strip between the Atlantic Ocean on one side and the Great South Bay on the other. This area is quiet, remote, and at times completely deserted. Ocean Parkway itself feels like a road that shouldn't exist. A ribbon of pavement running through the dunes, marsh grass, and patches of thick brush so dense that even in daylight you can lose your sense of direction. There are miles where there's nothing but sand, water, and wind. And then, scattered down between these stretches of emptiness, you will find pockets of small communities, places like Oak, places like Oak Beach, Gilgo Beach, and Cedar Beach. These aren't communities with rows of restaurants or shops now. These are clusters of homes, many of them seasonal, many of them very expensive, tucked tightly together behind brush, small paths, and private drives. By day, it's peaceful. By night, it is pitch black, silent, and isolated. If you don't know your way around, you can get turned around immediately. There are no street lights. When you stand out there at 4 or 5 in the morning, it feels like the rest of the world does not exist. It was into this setting, a wealthy, private, tightly knit community surrounded by dark marshland and nearly 16 miles of underbrush, that Shannon Gilbert ran for her life in the early hours of May 1st, 2010. And that's where this story begins, because the location matters, the geography matters, and the isolation of Gilgo Beach is a major reason why what happened there stayed hidden for so long. Without the remote landscape of that barrier island, without the miles of brush that was thick enough to hide anything, without the nighttime emptiness and the darkness of that stretch of Ocean Parkway, the Long Island serial killer might never have chosen it. Or he might have been discovered long before Shannon ever made her final 911 call. Let's talk about Shannon. Who was Shannon? Shannon Maria Gilbert was born on October 24th, 1986, in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. She grew up in a life marked by instability, and much of her childhood was shaped by poverty and difficult family circumstances. At various points, she and her sisters spent time in foster care. But despite all of that, Shannon had a lot of potential. People who knew her described her as bright, talkative, ambitious, and talented. She had a natural musical ability. She had a strong singing voice that she worked hard to develop. As a teen, she dreamed of performing professionally. She took lessons, she practiced constantly, and she wanted a different life. But like a lot of young women without resources, she found herself trying to support herself at a very young age. She worked regular jobs for a while. She worked in fast food, restaurant, and some temp jobs, anything that kept the rent paid. By her early 20s, she moved to New York City to try to give herself a fresh start. New York gave her opportunity, but it also gave her hardship. She struggled to pay rent. She struggled with anxiety. She had difficulty finding stable income, and like many young women in similar circumstances, she eventually turned to escorting. That's an important part of her story, not because it defines her, because it certainly does not, but because it places her in the orbit of the people and locations that ultimately shaped the events of May 1st, 2010. 2010. Shannon also had a complicated relationship with her family. Her mother, Mary, and her sisters, Sherry, Sarah, and Stevie. There was closeness, but also distance, support, but a lot of conflict. It was not a simple family dynamic, but they were present in her life and she was present in theirs. She would check in, she would visit, and she would reconnect. Shannon was not a runaway. She was not estranged, and Shannon was not living on the streets. She was a young woman trying to piece together a life with the limited tools she had, doing what she could to survive in a city that is notoriously hard on anyone without a safety net. When she disappeared, she became known internationally for how the discovery of her case uncovered others. And it's a shame, really, because her dream was to sing. She was talented. She had trained hard. And it's a shame that she couldn't have stayed and been known internationally for that. She was a talented young woman, a sister, a daughter, and someone who had been trying to build a future. To understand the timeline of Shannon's disappearance, we have to understand how she operated as an escort. Because her setup that night was typical for her, but it's not typical of everyone, and it shaped everything that followed. Shannon was not working on the streets. Can't emphasize that enough. Many times people hear that someone's an escort and they immediately say, well, they're a call girl and they work in the sex business, and so they're naturally at risk and they're not taking care of themselves or not being safe. Shannon was not that way. She was not working on the streets. She worked through Craigslist and independent ads, which was extremely common in the mid to late 2000s. Craigslist had what it called the erotic services section at the time. Now, I don't know if that's still there, and I'm not really a user of Craigslist, so I couldn't tell you. But thousands of escorts used it to screen clients, set appointments, and manage interactions. It was not the high end escort world that you see on television and you hear about where clients pay $800 to $1,500 an hour. But it also wasn't low end world, the street level work that you hear about, and that so many women fall prey to. Shannon and many escorts like her occupied a mid-range model. She charged moderate rates. She worked indoors, and she used a driver for security. So she was thinking about security, and she was doing things to protect herself. This was not a woman that was taking lightly the job that she was doing. She also, it should be noted, she was working in expensive areas. So she wasn't going and flagging someone down that she didn't know and going home with them or going somewhere with them. So she had a driver named Michael Pack. He's often referred to as just Pack, and his job was straightforward. He picked her up, he drove her to the client's location, he waited outside during the appointment, and she made sure she got back to the car and home safely. This setup was considered protective, not perfect protection, but more than working alone and more than many other escorts even took the time to set up. Shannon had been escorting for about 3 to 4 years off and on, and she treated it like work. She was a professional. She scheduled appointments, she kept a phone specifically for clients, and she followed a routine that was consistent enough that people around her knew what nights she worked and what her schedule typically looked like. She was not inexperienced, she was not new, and she was not careless. Her model of escorting, internet-based, appointment-based, driver-supported, was the reason she ended up in Oak Beach that night. Clients in that area, particularly men with privacy and money, often booked escorts online so they could meet in their homes without leaving a trace. Many of these men were married, they had relationships, and they did not want anyone knowing what they were doing. So this afforded them a path to do that. But it generally kept people a little bit safer because they weren't just working with anyone, and often they went back repeatedly to the same clients. And when Shannon accepted the appointment that brought her to Oak Beach, it fit into her normal pattern. Nothing about it seemed unusual. Not the time, not the location, not the client, not the setup. This was routine for her. I want to point that out because this was not something she just, oh, let me do this, even though I've got misgivings about it. This was routine for her. And that routine is important because it makes what happened next, the panic, the 911 call, the frantic running from house to house in a gated community, that much more alarming. Something broke that pattern, something changed. But before we get into that night, before we talk about the 911 call and how Shannon's disappearance led to the discovery of multiple victims, we need to close with this one point. Shannon Gilbert was not simply a victim. Her disappearance triggered the search that uncovered one of the largest investigations in recent history. And whether she realized it or not, her final moments led to her final moments, I'm sorry, my voice is breaking in and out. Her final moments led to revelations that law enforcement had missed for over a decade. So by the time May 1st, 2010 arrived, Shannon's routine was well established. She and her driver, Michael, accepted an appointment in the Oak Beach community. She was in communication with her driver, so this wasn't something that she just dropped on him. She wanted to make sure that he knew where she was, when she was there. He took her there. He waited on her, and he made sure she got home. So they knew that she had accepted an appointment in the Oak Beach community. The client was Joseph Brewer, a homeowner living in a quiet, gated pocket of that barrier island. They arrived around 2 a.m. Michael stayed in the vehicle as he always did. Again, this was routine, nothing new. Shannon went inside Brewer's home for the appointment. According to Brewer, everything was normal at first. He would later tell investigators there was no argument, no violence, and no threats exchanged between the two of them, that everything was fine. His account was that suddenly Shannon became agitated for reasons he didn't understand. At some point, things shifted. Something happened in that house, something that caused Shannon to panic. Now, we don't really know what triggered it because Michael was not in the home at the time. No one's ever given a clear explanation, but the series of events that followed are firmly documented. At approximately 4:51 a.m., now remember, she got there at her appointment time at 2. Nearly 3 hours later, she called 911. The call lasted 23 minutes. During the call, she repeatedly said, "They're trying to kill me." You can also hear her in the call saying, "Stop it, stop it. What are you doing? You're trying to kill me." We don't know what was going on, but she was clearly frightened. This was not a woman that was, in a brand new situation. I mean, this was a woman who took safety seriously, and she went to a place where she had undoubtedly been before, from all accounts. And so we don't know exactly what happened, but Brewer said he tried to calm her down, but that made her even worse. Michael Pack tried to enter the home to get her, and Shannon was reportedly becoming more and more distressed even when Michael was there. And according to Michael, she believed he was part of whatever she thought was happening. She fled the house and ran out into the darkness. At that hour, Oak Beach was silent. There were no lights, there was no traffic, no one was around, only the sound of the wind, the marsh, and occasional waves hitting the shoreline. Shannon ran down the street, knocking on doors, calling for help. Several residents heard her and several called 911, but none stayed with her long enough for the police to arrive. And this is the big shame of this. Part of the problem is that Shannon kept running off because she was terrified of something. One homeowner said she seemed disoriented. Another said she just appeared terrified. Another said she claimed someone was trying to kill her and that she needed to keep going. Michael Pack tried to follow behind her in the car, but Shannon continued running. Witnesses reported she avoided him, yelling that she didn't trust him now. And then, after her last known appearance at a neighbor's door, Shannon ran into the marsh. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. Despite multiple 911 calls from residents, police never made contact with Shannon that night. No officer intercepted her path, and no officer reached the marsh before sunrise. Shannon's disappearance remained a missing persons case for months. And if the story ended there, we'd be talking only about Shannon. But the search for Shannon became something else entirely. Now, part of the issue here is that when she went missing, her mother and sister really put the pressure on to emphasize to people, hey, she did not take this lightly. She was serious. She treated this as a business. She had a security detail, really, in Michael. I mean, he really sort of was her security detail. But here's something that I want to point out. Something clearly happened. It has been dismissed too many times. I've watched this over and over in shows and interviews. And the problem is, for whatever reason, her interaction and reaction that night is dismissed. Why did she have that, that freak out moment, really? Something happened. Was she drugged? Did someone slip something into her drink? Did she take something she didn't normally take? Did someone try to get her to do something she wasn't comfortable doing? And she tried to tell them no, and they threatened her. I know what the authorities have said, and I understand what the investigators said. I find it very hard to believe that a woman who treated this as a profession, as a business, took precautions, suddenly went into a place she'd been before and just flipped out. Now, a lot has been said about her upbringing and about there being mental issues in the family and challenges in the family. And all of that can be true, but she never had an episode like this before. And she knew Michael. He drove her for the last 3 or 4 years to these places. Why in the world would she suddenly believe that Michael was out to get her? Something happened in that home. Something Shannon was not prepared for. Something that was not told to Michael when he walked in. Something happened. And I believe that whatever happened in that home was something she was not comfortable with. And then she was either threatened or put into a position where she was going to be forced to do something she didn't want to do, and maybe given some type of drug or alcohol that she wasn't used to. And then I believe that whoever was in that home with her, Brewer or whoever, reached out to Michael, and he came into the house or came to the door. And by this point, she didn't know what to believe because she was just so freaked out. If you've ever had panic or you've ever been in a situation where you're scared, you might recall that there comes a point where you don't really know what to believe and who to trust because your mind is taken over and you're absolutely terrified. Think about being in a situation where you're walking down the street and you realize someone's following you. Many women have been in that situation, and you realize that there's someone not looking at you right, or someone's following behind you, and all of a sudden you don't know who to trust. Do you trust the driver that pulls up and says, "Hey, are you okay?" No, you don't know what to believe. And I think that is what happened to Shannon that night. Something unusual, something she was not comfortable with, happened in that house that night. And rather than it be a situation where they said, "Okay, you know what? If you don't want to do this, or you're not comfortable with this, we'll let this go. Don't worry about it." I think that something went beyond that point, and they could not stop. And I think she knew she was in grave danger at that home. Now, she ran out into the marsh, and she was a missing persons case for months. We're going to talk about the 23-minute 911 call, but I also want to talk about the fact that when all is said and done, the authorities have declared that this has nothing to do with any of the other things that come about. And I'm really not sure about that at all. Okay, one of the most controversial parts of this case is that 911 call. And it's a call that law enforcement withheld from the public for more than a decade. This is appalling. It really is. And here's what is known about it from official reports, transcripts, and statements. And there are a lot of people that don't believe that we've ever heard everything. And because they withheld it, I'm not quite sure we have. And I hate to feel that way, but I just don't know that we've been given everything. Shannon called 911 at 4:51 a.m. The call lasted 23 minutes, and that's unusually long for a distress call. So Shannon knew enough. She wasn't out of it so much that she couldn't call 911 and try to explain to them, or at least have them on the phone when whatever was happening to her was happening. Because at times you hear her talking to 911, but at times you hear her clearly talking to who she feels is trying to harm her. And I believe that she had the wherewithal to put the 911 call on and was trying to explain what was going on. Now, I have heard live 911 calls in domestic violence cases. I worked for a jurisdiction for a number of years, and our dispatch area often would have calls from people who were being abused or thought they were about to be abused, and they would leave the line open. And then what we would hear were calls that stated things like a conversation between the woman, and you could hear the man getting upset, frustrated, and he loses it, can't control himself. And the next thing you know, he's beating on her. And you can hear that. So what we were able to do in those scenarios, and Amy worked in the dispatch area directly, so she can talk to this a lot more than I can. But what we were able to do was take that information and know where to respond. Because when the line was open, we could have the dispatch officer communicating or patching it in directly to the officer so that the officers knew what they were walking into, because domestic violence can be one of the most dangerous scenarios for law enforcement. So I think that it's possible that Shannon called 911, explained it, and then left that line open purposely. But throughout the call, you hear Shannon repeatedly saying, "They're trying to kill me. Please help me. I don't know where I am." She couldn't give a clear address, and she did not name anyone that she believed was threatening her. She sounded scared, confused, hyperventilating at times, and disoriented. Her tone was panicked, but her statements were consistent. She believed someone was after her. And this was not the way Shannon reacted. And because she could not give them a clear address, and she knew where she went because she booked the appointment, That's why I believe some type of drug or something she was not used to was given to her. Her tone was panicked, but she still was able to communicate something's wrong here. Now, voices heard on the call. According to the reports the dispatcher heard, Shannon, a male voice believed to be Brewer, and a male voice believed to be Pack, Michael Pack, her driver. At no point did the call clearly identify an attacker. Michael later said that Shannon was having what he believed was a psychological episode, and Brewer would later say he didn't know why she panicked. But, Michael had known her for a while, and unless he knew that she was prone to something like this, it doesn't explain why she would have this. And you know what? Even if she was having a psychological episode, doesn't mean somebody wasn't out to get her. Now, this is where the handling becomes problematic when the police respond. Well, or don't. Because while the call was active, they didn't dispatch units with urgency. That bothers me greatly because we all hope that if we open the line to 911, we're doing it because someone is on the way, right? So the fact that they did not send out units really bothers me. They did not treat it as an active threat. I mean, this woman is crying out. She's panicking. She's running from door to door, and nobody's coming to help her. That just angers me. No immediate search began, and officers later said they could not determine her location clearly enough to respond properly. First of all, that's a load, okay? Her driver knew where she was. He took her there. They had this process in place to safeguard her. It wouldn't have taken anything for the police to listen to that 911 call or talk to dispatchers and Michael to say, hey, yeah, this is where we are. We're at Brewer's house. This is the address. We're at Oak Beach. I mean, that's a no-brainer to me, and that just infuriates me. And honestly, it makes me concerned that if I ever needed to call 911, now I don't live in that area and I don't live in a private gated community that might have reasons to want to pay for private security from off-duty officers who keep their mouth shut. But I would like to think that if I call 911, somebody's going to respond, even if I'm not making a lot of sense, especially if I'm not making a lot of sense. Yeah, I know I'm ranting about this, but this bothers me greatly. The police are supposed to be there to protect us, no matter who we are, no matter where we are, no matter what time we're there. But this is what bothers me again. Multiple neighbors called 911 separately. They would have seen their names popping up on the system. In 2010, I am sure, well, I know in our smaller jurisdiction, the information popped up on the dispatch screen and it would say where the caller's name, it would have their phone number, and it would have their address. That's what 911 systems are built for. The residents reported a young woman banging on doors. Some reported she appeared frightened and confused. Why wasn't that enough to get police out there with some urgency? They should have been lights on, running in. But with all of that, she was never located that night. And there are so many opinions. Some say she had a panic attack. So what? Even if she had a panic attack, someone should have been there to help her. Some say she was under the influence. So what? Someone should have still helped her. You can have a panic attack. You can be under the influence and still be in danger. Some say she genuinely believed she was in danger. Well, obviously she did. Listen to the 911 call. Others believe she was in danger based on the totality of the circumstances that later emerged. What is a fact is that her fear was real to her, and she communicated it repeatedly and consistently for 23 minutes before running into the night. Her final words on the call have never publicly been released in full detail. But the available summaries paint a clear picture. She believed her life was at risk and she was desperate for someone to find her. And I want to know why the final words on the call have never been released. If she really was just a person that got lost that night in an area that was obscured and had no street lights and she didn't know where she was going, then why not release the final words? After all this time, I don't understand why the cover up, because that's what it is a cover up. Well, we're going to talk about now how it uncovered the Gilgo Beach murders. Because if you think things were ugly before and you didn't know anything about this case, and you aren't alarmed right now by the fact that a young girl calls 911 repeatedly, knocks on neighbors' doors, they all kind of call 911 and still no one comes out. What I'm about to tell you about now is really going to alarm you. Shannon's disappearance led to a search that changed everything, but it didn't happen overnight. For months, Suffolk County Police Department conducted limited searches of the marshland and surrounding areas, and they treated her disappearance as a single incident, not connected to anything larger. Shannon's family would not leave it alone. They hired an attorney to represent them, and they pushed and pushed and pushed because they were determined she was not going to just be forgotten. They were going to find her. They knew something was wrong. But they couldn't get the 911 call. They couldn't find anything. In December of 2010, a police officer conducting a training exercise, not searching, okay, training exercise with his canine, searched along Ocean Parkway, not far from where Shannon disappeared. During this search, the dog alerted him to human remains in the brush. But guess what? They weren't Shannon's. They belonged to Melissa Bartholomew, another missing escort. Are you starting to see something here? This discovery triggered a deeper search. Within days, 3 more women were found in the same quarter-mile radius. All were escorts. All disappeared under similar circumstances. All were wrapped or posed in a similar manner. These 4 women became known as the Gilgo Four. The media picked up the story. The community panicked. And investigators realized they had uncovered the work of a serial killer, but it didn't stop there. As the search expanded outward, more remains were discovered. Some were partial, some were decades old. Some matched cases across Long Island and even other states. By the time the discovery phase ended, over 10 sets of human remains had been found in the Gilgo, Oak Beach, and Jones Beach areas. And none of this would have been uncovered had it not been for the search for Shannon Gilbert. Her disappearance forced law enforcement to look in areas they had never searched, areas where someone had been disposing of victims for years. And even with an arrest, there's questions. Oh, I have lots of questions. Today, with a suspect charged in several of the Gilgo murders, it might appear the case is heading towards closure, but there are so many investigators, police officers, journalists, and advocates who believe that the victims may be number of victims may be higher, the timelines may be longer, there may be more than one offender, some remains may be unrelated but point to multiple predators using that same isolated area and possibly even working together to cover up for one another. Law enforcement may have overlooked or mishandled earlier opportunities, and Shannon's own death remains heavily debated. Because when Shannon's body was ultimately found, although she led to these other ladies that were also escorts, officials declared that Shannon's death did not have anything to do with this and that it was accidental. I just, coincidences, maybe, but this one would be one heck of a coincidence. Really would. That she's in that area. She's having a problem that night. She runs into the void. She's calling 911. She's screaming and begging for help. She's banging on people's doors. She disappears in that area. And then lo and behold, all these other women, escorts, mind you, who work the same area, are found, and they're not related. And there's so many questions about Shannon's. There's questions about Shannon's because there's something that they don't want us to know. I firmly believe that. This episode is meant to give you the foundation, the who, the where, the how, and the why of Shannon's disappearance and the larger Gilgo Beach investigation and its environment. But this case is so complex, and it's far more than one recording can cover. Amy and I both are going to be working on this case together to bring it to you. And we want to do this all the way throughout to discuss the arrest and the trial that's going to come up. There are inconsistencies in statements, timelines that don't add up, conflicting accounts from witnesses, questions about law enforcement's handling of the situation, unanswered questions about the 911 call, issues surrounding the search, and the larger implications of the Gilgo murder investigation. There's also the whole issue with the attorney who represents the Gilbert family. There's a whole story about the Gilbert family that takes place after all of this. And that's where Amy's series begins. She's going to be taking this case piece by piece. She's going to be taking this case piece by piece and breaking it open. And then I'm going to pop in as well and give information. We're going to break down the evidence, the contradictions, the timelines, and the unanswered questions. And there are a lot of unanswered questions. We'll be moving back and forth between these recordings and the full visual breakdowns on YouTube, bringing you a comprehensive look at not only Shannon's case, but the entire web surrounding the Long Island serial killer investigation. What Shannon revealed changed everything, and the deeper we look, the clearer it becomes. There's still a lot we don't know. Stay with us. Amy's going to pick it up from here. This is Case by Case.